So good morning. My name is P.G. Forrest. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy here at the University of Calgary. And among all you eminent people, I'm probably a total imposter. My field is health policy and not at all environment and energy. This is really a case where rank has trumped competency and capacity. I have eminent colleagues that will have been much better placed. You will surely notice that during the panel. We're better placed to do this work this morning. We have been asked essentially to revisit the same issues that have been discussed in the first panel, conciliation between economic growth and the protection of the environment, the polarization, the political debate in Canada, the problem of what kind of evidence can we use in public discussions at this time. It has not been discussed in depth this morning, but has been mentioned. And a question that has been asked by David Dodge in his own presentation about which I think should be the thrust of this particular panel, and which is what are the tools at our disposal at this time that can be used by Canada as a nation to actually successfully do this work of conciliation between, as I said, economic growth and environmental protection. I will follow the brilliant example of Chris and use the same format. So I will do a very short introduction to our four panelists. You have their full bios on the website of the event if ever you want to have more information. And then I will keep the middle seat for myself, and we will start from there. Again, inviting questions from the audience after a few minutes of exchange. So first panelist for this second panel is Stephen Cornish. He's the CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation. I don't need to present this foundation here, I'm sure. Stephen, before joining DSF, spent 5 years as the executive director of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders Canada, where he led a team that I think have been able to usher tremendous change and growth in the organization. Stephen has also served the Canadian Red Cross and Care Canada, sits on the board of directors for several charitable organizations, including honorary member with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. So, Stephen, could you join? Second panelist is Karen Ann Hilton, CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, as well as the CEO of Transformation International, an award-winning First Nation social and economic development company. Carolyn is a recognized First Nation business leader with international master degrees in business management from the University of Hertfordshire in England. Carol is from Nusalt Nul Dessen from the Esquat Nation on Vancouver Island. Interesting to mention that Carolyn has been appointed as a senior advisor to Canadian Federal Economic Growth Council, which advised, it's very difficult to know at this time, the Finance Minister Morneau on Canadian economic growth. Preston Manning. Preston is an old friend of mine and probably doesn't need any presentation, but as you know, is the founder and president of the Manning Center for Building Democracy that he founded in 2005, a senior fellow of both the Fraser Institute, the Marketplace Institute at Regent College, UBC, and as you know, served as a member of parliament from 93 to 2001, has founded two political parties, and that one of them was the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament. Important thing, and the reason I have been in touch with Preston for many years is that he has been an advocate of green conservatism, stressing the importance of living within our means ecologically as well as fiscally, the benefits of harnessing market mechanism to environmental conservation. And last but not least, Carissima Mathen is a vice dean academic and a professor at the law school at the University of Ottawa. She's a specialist in constitutional law, criminal law, and U.S. constitutional law. Widely published scholar, frequent media commentator. From 1994 to 2001, she was a director of litigation for the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, and where she litigated a number of Charter of Rights decisions. So I will ask my 4 panelists to join me on the stage, if you may. Sorry, please. How are you? So the title of the panel is about good public policy for Canada as a whole, and I was thinking about this. What's the difference between the conversation we had in the first part of the morning and the conversation we need to have now? And I was thinking of something I learned actually from David Dodge originally, but Jean Charest alluded to this question in his own remarks previously. The fact that public policy, good or bad, exists only as much and as long as they are implemented. And the implementation of policies, we could talk about this for sometimes, because I think it has been one of the issues that has faced the new federal government during its first year of mandate, in particular, the difficulty of realizing that policies do not exist before you have been thinking about implementation, and implementation is the hard part of policy making. But it means that to implement policy, to make them real, you need political support. You need efficient political support, that there is no policy in our system without politics. It means that one of the challenges we're facing is not only that we could have good ideas and we could reach consensus on a number of questions, but without proper implementation, and therefore without proper political support for these solutions, they will never happen. So, the first question I would like to ask everyone on the panel is that, am I right to think that politics is, at this moment, the most important challenge we're facing in terms of public policy in the actualization of what is called on the material for this conference, good public policy in environment and economy? Preston, do you want to start?
Well, I think politics is important for obvious reasons, but I think the higher up you get in the political system, the task of parties, of governing parties particularly, and the task of government, the ultimate task of democratic government is the reconciliation of conflicting interests by non-coercive means.
Could you say that again, but slowly?
Reconciliation of conflicting interests. Oh, okay. Can we turn the mic on back there?
Okay, while you're mic'd, maybe, Stephen, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I think it's clear from what we've heard this morning how important politics is, but we seem to have also have a big difficulty in seeing that politics be driving us apart on some of these questions, on some of the stakeholders that need to be at these tables doing the same, sinking into this polarization. And I think part of the difficulty is we really haven't jointly established a vision of where we're trying to go. And we also don't yet agree fundamentally on the extent of the problem at hand. We heard from David a little bit of a discussion about how far off into the future this was, almost as if it was Netherlands, something we had to do, but maybe not so much today. We had only a very small entry into the discussion around rights, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that, and I think Indigenous rights is important, but we didn't speak of our own rights to health. We didn't speak of intergenerational rights, of the place we want to leave for future generations. We spoke of how we've managed to get here as a society, and that's been very much on the development of fossil fuels, as we heard, which has served us very, very well. But we've now come to a stage where when we're looking at climate change and where we're going, if we heard this morning that half of us wouldn't be here were it not for oil, what we're starting to see the science tell us is that half of us and half of the species in the world will not be here if we only remain fixed on oil. And then the debate is when. And the science is telling us that by the end of the century, so by 2100, we'll need to be at zero carbon, so taking carbon out of the atmosphere and not emitting any more. And that somewhere by mid-century, we'll need to be at carbon neutral. Now, the question is, how do we get there, at what speed? But we're not yet agreed on, and we don't even have an actual roadmap to agree on how to get there. So I'm not sure that policy and politics by itself is the fundamental import if it's not able to communicate those challenges, if it's not able to federate the provinces around not only our own national interest, but also our international interest, which I think there's a dichotomy between and that we still have to look at with some detail.
Preston, you were interrupted.
Yes, if my mic is working. I think the ultimate challenge of the political system, and the higher you get in a democratic system, the more this is true, is the reconciliation of conflicting interests by non-coercive means. And I think the higher up you get in government, it's not a matter of choosing between one interest or another. Often the problem is choosing between two good interests, but how do you reconcile conflicting interests by non-coercive means by the political process? And we could spend a lot of time on the various steps, but I think one of the first steps is, first of all, to identify all the major interests and ensure that they are represented in the discussion. And I think we have trouble doing that. If this room, I've been in dozens of meetings in this room, many of them by the energy sector. If this was being held 30 years ago, there probably wouldn't have, talking about the future of the energy industry, there probably wouldn't have been anybody representing Indigenous people, and there probably wouldn't have been anybody representing the environment. But I notice our panel, there's nobody representing the energy producer, the energy consumer, or the energy investor, or the energy supply. We're bouncing from one end of not being represented to the other. And I think the effective reconciliation and conflicting interests would identify all the interests and then see what course of action might reconcile them.
So Carissima.
Well, politics obviously operates at many different levels, and if we look at it at the macro legal level, I mean, the Constitution provides a way for politics to be done, but the tension there is between certainty and finality. For example, a third-party investor that wants to know that a particular project can go forward, and a feeling that a particular decision is correct. So how do we bridge what I like to think is good faith disagreement? That's a very profound challenge, and the Constitution gives us means to get to certainty through a hierarchy of decision making, culminating, of course, with the courts. But it doesn't, it doesn't provide necessarily the means to know which decision is right. That's explicitly, I think, left to political actors to work out. And certainly there's historically been a deference on the part of courts to intergovernmental cooperation, and that's really what's highly prized. And so when you have a breakdown between that, or in that process, as we potentially have right now, then we're turning to the courts, but we're not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to like what you get, and it's not necessarily predictable either. So I think the politics at the macro level now is particularly challenging, and that I would just add to that we think about provincial federal relations, which is has a long history, of course. When you overlay onto that a completely separate element, which is Indigenous rights, which is its own source of constitutional obligation, we're just now starting to confront the relationship between federalism on the one hand and the obligations that we have to this other constituency.
Caroline?
Thank you. I would first acknowledge essentially that the political design from which we speak this morning is from Treaty 7 territory. So when we recognize the political will to recognize that, that essentially is the political pathway that will allow us a successful framework in terms of supporting this difficult, this polarizing narrative that we're currently experiencing. The visibility of that narrative versus the invisibility of that narrative and how that's playing out is essentially that polarization of a discussion between growth and rights, between our experience of economy and our ability to engage within Canada and how we understand policy essentially. What I see is this inclusion and the evolution of the Indigenous relationship is an essential component that is increasingly becoming visible within the Canadian narrative, and particularly within the energy and environment discussion around policy. Thank you.
Yeah. So I would like that we continue to integrate this idea that this part of the problem when we talk about Canada as a whole is that it now clearly includes the need to have a conversation that ends on full reconciliation with Indigenous people, and that it is part of the narrative now. But once again, when we're talking about the politics of this conciliation between environment and economic growth, the thing that struck me is that I'm not sure I'm seeing this being possible at this moment nationally. You know, I was listening this week, Chantal Hébert commenting on the political situation in Quebec and mentioning that basically an anti-pipeline party will be running in the next federal election. So do you really think we could have a national conversation in those circumstances? And if I were in Quebec this morning, I will be taking other examples. I will talk about supply management and the way everybody in Alberta is taking for granted that this should disappear. But when you're in Quebec and you're living in a rural area, this is part of the way of maintaining your lifestyle and your landscape. And you're very much attached to this. So how do we have a national conversation when each part of the country is completely convinced that their particular vision of the common good for the nation is the good one, is the right one?
Well, I think, and this was dealt with by the other panel to some degree, what exaggerates these differences and gets people going in opposite directions is this polarization on virtually every issue. So the real question behind your question is, what do you do in a polarized political situation? How can you combat it? And there are certain things you can do. One thing is you can change the conceptual framework within which the debate occurs so that it's not quite so polarized. We did a survey a while back of 2,200 millennials, and we asked them, where do you put yourself on the left, right, center spectrum, the old spectrum? The most frequent answer was, we don't like that axis. And so we tried to look for, are there some other axes that we can conduct a political discussion with you? Where are you on a democratic axis? Do you like bottom-up decision-making? Do you like top-down decision-making? Where are you on environment axis? Do you like solving problems by regulation? Do you like using market mechanisms? Where are you? Changing the conceptual framework for an issue can deal with the polarization. A second thing you can do, I don't particularly like this, but sometimes you can get trade-offs between the polarized groups. This is how federal-provincial relations work. I'll agree to what you're proposing, which I don't like, if you'll agree to what I want, which you don't like. For example, in this BC-Alberta situation, I could have conceived years ago where Alberta could say, look, we recognize that our pipeline and that will create Aboriginal problems for you and environmental problems for you. But your Site C dam, it's exactly the other way around. You get the economic benefits, we get the downstream environmental effects. When you built the WAC Bennett Dam, you dried up the delta of the Peace River. Can you imagine the scandal that would create today? And the trade-off will be, we will not seek an injunction against Site C if you do not seek an injunction against Trans Mountain. There's that trade-off. It's not the best way, but it's a way to get a deal. So I think there are ways of dealing with polarized situation. And the third one, and I shouldn't go on, the third one is you need mediators, and not judicial mediators. You need mediators who identify with both sides and who can try to bring the sides together. And often the trouble with that kind of mediation is the mediator gets killed in the end, but you get reconciliation. It's actually a religious principle, if you want to get
But I'm not sure it's actually, I mean, it's good that it's funny, but it's actually true. I mean, we are at such a state of polarization that the sides looking at each other can't find a way to agree. but it's not like that's something new in the world. We've had conflict resolution and following conflict resolution partnership building exercises that have played fruit in many different areas of the world. You look at Northern Ireland, or you look at Sri Lanka, where sides were fighting and killing each other for 30 years. We're not at that level, right? But as long as we're only deal making, the problem with the trade-offs is if we don't have some shared vision of what we agree on and identify where we have our different visions and bring them together in a partnership where you do have mediation, you're not going to get beyond just the feeling that you don't trust the other, so they're trying to one-up you. And that means going back a step before partnership building to really conflict resolution. And that's, I think, in some senses where we are, because we have groups who feel aggrieved and long since agreed. So until we can hear those grievances, those folks aren't going to be able to come and have trust in the table that we're discussing with. And when we are so polarized, it's also very difficult to have the folks that are in power or the people driving the bus or the politicians be the ones to take those risks. And what happens in classical conflict resolution is you do a track two process, where you bring together folks like Ecofiscal panel members and others to try to debate not on the current problem, so not to debate on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, but to debate on the state of the future that we want to see. And then on the needs that come along the way, which are around just transition, which are energy. A new energy future actually polls across Canada and all parties. 75% of Canadians want to see a renewable energy future for Canada. Well, there's something everyone can agree on. So you start to find the places where there are commonalities and you work back from that. And it's a process that takes time, because as we heard this morning, not only is trust extremely lacking, which means that we all have to look at ourselves as the ones who are carrying the message and how we communicate, but we also have to open up the tent of communication. And I thought that was a very good point that you made, Preston, starting, that a few years ago this panel wouldn't have had Aboriginal people or an environmentalist perhaps. But who else are we missing in these discussions? And in stakeholders discussions, we're seeing more and more of the democratization of everything in our society. With the new generation, they want to be involved. They don't just naturally trust someone else. And so we have to find ways to bring a number of voices together, and that means a dirty, long process, but probably we'll get somewhere longer in the long term of agreement and actually setting out a vision that we can jointly build towards than if we just make deal making in the short term. Now that may be unrealistic, or we could just keep going around the same table.
You know, I don't want to drag this issue forever, but I still think from my lay, naive perspective that polarization, when it is entrenched in geography and territory, is different from just a question of having different ideas. And I think this is why we are facing this problem. When I see from the outside the situation now between BC and Alberta, I see problems entrenched in geography, and not only problems that are entrenched in different opinions about climate change or different opinions about, you know, what are the means by which we could actually mitigate climate change. Carissima?
Well, I mean, the original federal project and the challenge of it was to reconcile unity with diversity. And of course, the Federation has only become more diverse. And you know, we've just passed our sesquicentennial. You know, in 1867, the challenge was around certain minority interests, and now I think it is equally about geography. And you know, I think Canadians identify very passionately with their provinces as much as with the national identity. I would also say that when we're talking about the reconciliation of interests, we need to recognize the different ways that can be operating. So for many, this is a fundamental moral question about stewardship of the environment for people as a whole. For others, it's a really immediate question of, let's say, economic survival. And we can't really get away from fundamental questions about inequality and how that is mediated and experienced, because if you feel that your very survival is at stake, you're going to come to the debate from a very different perspective.
I've seen an alarming tendency to lean on national interest and the ability to facilitate within that space, as an Indigenous person, the end argument, the end point is national interest. However, the evolution of a national interest across time, the polarization that exists within the Indigenous relationships is largely based on the lack of recognition and the lack of inclusion and the lack of a space at the economic table of this country. So essentially, for the ability to establish recognition, of which this current federal government has begun to facilitate, as really a starting point to look at it as an inception to the point of the cost of doing nothing is now outweighing the risk of doing nothing in the quality of the Indigenous relationship. So essentially, from that perspective, convening the ability to focus on that will require some principles of design, of which this country is currently lacking, and of which there is also no leadership in either convening or the designing.
Yeah, it's my take on the current government is that they are not very good when they don't have a clear sense of what their endpoint is. And I think that on Indigenous relationship at this moment, we don't have a sense of what is the endpoint of their policy. And a lot of things are going on, a lot of things are happening, most of them positive, but it's not clear what they want to achieve in the end, and I think it creates the kind of problem you're describing.
And I mean, I can speak directly from what I would like to achieve in my work in Indigenomics through the Indigenomics Institute. The current value of the Indigenous economy is estimated to be $32 billion in 2016. The work of the concept of Indigenomics is to facilitate the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy in 5 years. So essentially, that facilitation of that requires the space for economic inclusion, participation, and modern Indigenous economic design that's participating in the energy discussion of this country and the policy implications of that in a very real and a very different way.
I will invite people to start moving to the microphone so that we could start having an exchange with the room, with the audience. One of the questions I have for the four of you while people are thinking about their question is, again, my impression from the outside is that 2-3 years ago there was a sense of a very large consensus that was embodied in Ottawa by Justin Trudeau and in Edmonton by Rachel Notley, that, and basically the equation was quite simple: carbon tax equals social license. And the idea was that we have the recipe. There was a way of achieving this conciliation that we have been discussing since the morning. What is left of that consensus? What is left of this?
I think it's moving backwards. Maybe I'm wrong, but this idea that by the government taking ownership of Trans Mountain, somehow that's going to grant social license for that project. The objections to that was not to who owned it, it's to the project. And I don't think that, if the assumption there was that change in ownership is going to grant social license to that pipeline, I think that's completely fallacious. In fact, I think it exaggerates the problem, because the protesters against the pipeline think a political entity is more vulnerable to protest and political protest than even a private company. So I think that social license concept is off the rails and has been shunted off the rails more by this recent development.
Anyone else on this, Stephen?
I'd just say around the actual engagement and the stakeholder engagement is not felt to be genuine, which is a real problem if you've announced that you're going to build social license. And so there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we're approaching these issues. And we build and have had great success in building, here, the Canada Energy Strategy, which was laying out a framework. We need a Canada energy and environment strategy if we're going to be able to put these two things together. And what we have now is a dissonance in the policy sphere. We have the greenhouse gas things coming on this side. We have the NEB things on a different side. We have Aboriginal reconciliation on a different side. All of these things are in their own little bucket, and the courts, at the end of the day, are the ones that are solving it. But it also comes back to there's a fundamental disagreement at the beginning about what we're really trying to achieve. We don't really have a national vision or a purpose on this. And I sit on a number of panels on the high expert panel on plastic reduction, on the GHG regulatory and program committee. These committees are all built to try to find these kinds of consensus. And I'll use the plastic one so that it's separate from this discussion. The whole thing is set up to get to zero disposable plastic going into the environment and the oceans. So everybody agrees that's a good idea, and everyone comes together. And you've got the folks that design plastic, you've got the folks that market plastic, you've got the folks that are busy producing plastic, you've got citizen groups that are trying to reduce reusable plastic. And at the end of a whole 3/4 of the day, where everyone's working on how we're going to get to this charter that's being unrolled now at the G7, we figure out that Canada is going to lead on the international scene, but in fact, we've not done our homework at home. And then we find out from one of the gentlemen who will remain nameless, who's backing one of the largest expansions of turning fuel into plastics. And to him, the only place that plastic is misperforming is in the marine environment because it's getting so much attention right now. And their plans are to increase our plastic output by 40% over the next decade to make up for the reduction in demand from the general fossil fuels going into cars and into other things that we're going to switch to electrification. So at the end of the day, we're still not trying to get to the same vision, and we're not trying to adapt and to change into something else in whatever period that you put out. And there's always this still tension between industry wanting to be able to self-regulate versus the government imposing, but we don't end up with the right mix that works for both economy and for environment and for where we're trying to get, because we never actually set and agree on the vision that we're all trying to work together on. We come together as Canadians and discuss nicely, but we stay in our boxes at the end of the day.
I still would like to go back to this point about the unraveling of this kind of consensus, Carolyn. Yeah.
I think there's a subtle difference between social license and social confidence. The institutions in the regulatory environment essentially right now or have been a movement of questioning the process and the establishment of that. I draw on the work of the Canadian Economic Growth Council, of which I sat on with Chris Reagan, that we recommended the focus on an agile regulatory system, to look at that as a focus to be globally competitive and to have a specific focus in what ways can we establish a business environment focused on investment and innovation, to see that actualized, to look at it from a globalized world and from a perspective of a responsive economic agenda, the relationship between the regulatory environment, the agility of that, and the quality of national narrative is much further than when we made the recommendation.
But I'd just add to your point that it's probably a mistake that the federal government has this role of overseeing the functions and the progress on this. You really need something that's at arm's length. The UK has an independent committee that looks at the targets, that looks at progress, that looks at where they're trying to get to, because fundamentally everyone's not going to be in accord with the federal government on many different issues. And if they're leading on this and missing any of the steps, missing communication, missing interprovincial, then it allows for all kinds of things to come in and interrupt things along the way.
Well, I have to say I was never as sold on the idea of social license as a concept that could overcome deep-seated disagreement about policy, except to the extent that social license would mean we have confidence in a particular decision-making process that will be reasoned and fair and relatively impartial. But clearly, that's so far beyond where we're at now, where really the disagreement is about the vision and the way forward. And process doesn't really seem to matter as much, and we haven't really figured out the way to have that discussion that takes into account the various constituencies. I mean, social license to Indigenous peoples, that from what I've heard, it means something very different than, for example, how the federal government may be conceptualizing it.
Oh, yes, yeah, I'm sure you haven't spoken enough yet.
I approached the microphone when there was nobody else there, so I took my opportunity. Steve has talked about a lack of a shared vision. I think every panelist has used the term national interest. My question is about the national interest. What is the national interest? How do we figure out what the national interest is? Whose job is it to articulate or to develop the national interest? And related question is it true that we were better at figuring this out long ago? Are we less good at it now? And if that's true, why? Is it because people have a tighter identification with their provinces and less with the country? Is it because the problems are fundamentally tougher than they were 30 years ago or 75 years ago? Is it because people have shorter attention spans? Is it maybe that I'm reading my history wrong and it was always tough? So what is the national interest? Whose job is it? And why does it appear to be tougher?
And I will take the second question as well.
So kind of relating to this idea of needing a consensus to move forward, one of the really difficult things about public policy is predicting second and third order effects. And as the world is getting more complex between trade linkages and the spread of the internet and online business and the tech community, are we better at predicting second and third order effects of policy now? And what is the risk that unforeseen impacts pose to the consensus or even to the national interest, should we be able to articulate it?
So two questions, one about the national interest, what it is and how it is defined, and the second one about our capacity to predict second order.
Okay, well, on the first one, Chris asked about three questions. Maybe the first one. First of all, I'd be careful about using the word national interest because people assume that's synonymous with the interest of the federal government. I don't accept that. I'd use the public interest as maybe how do you ascertain the public interest? And my approach on this is, I started out in physics before I couldn't handle the math, so I went into economics. But in physics, there's such a thing as a vector. A vector has two characteristics. One is magnitude and one is direction. And I think you can represent interest by vectors. So in my view, when we're trying to reconcile economy and environment, I got this graph with, grow the economy, stop the economy, preserve the environment, kill the environment. And we're trying to reconcile. And then I put these various interests. Where do we put the Indigenous interest? What's its direction? What magnitude do we assign to it? What do we give to the energy producers? What do we do to the various components? And the public interest is that vector which best reconciles those conflicting vectors. And as who should do that, I actually think there's a political role in that. I think the regulatory bodies, I wish some of the regulatory bodies had that matrix and that vector approach. But at the end of the day, when you do try to ascertain, here is the course and here's the weight that would be the best way we can think of for reconciling the environment and the economy, then it needs some political people with guts to push it. It will not be popular with everybody. In fact, it'll offend everybody, because everybody thinks their interest is synonymous with the public interest. No, it isn't. I used to tell Ed Whittingham when the Pembina, remember the Pembina Institute started when a sour gas well went out of control west of Drayton Valley there, killed a couple of people and killed a bunch of cows. And the Pembina Institute got its name from the Pembina River, which goes past that point. But I used to remind Ed and the founder of the Pembina is a tributary of the Athabasca, which is a tributary of the Peace River, which is a tributary of the Mackenzie. It's not the Athabasca. It's a tributary. It's one important component, but it's not the whole thing. And to accept that conception of the public interest, one has to recognize or accept that my interest is important. It's got this direction. I'm going to push it as high as I can, but it's not the whole thing. And the final decision is not going to be just doing what I want to do. So that's my short theory on the public interest.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to go in a much different direction with this answer and call into this space an uncomfortable space, because if I correlate the establishment of the original doctrine of discovery, which identified the requirement for the original inhabitants of this country to be Christian, and then made the connection that if not Christian, then we're not human, and therefore the land was empty. That as a core economic principle is foundational to the development of this country. That is the uncomfortable space that I'm calling onto the floor, that to parallel that to the evolution of today to be of what we're calling the national interest, the removal of Indigenous people into that space of what is national interest in this particular discussion of how national interest is playing out in the last month or so, that facilitation of national interest to the point of what it is today must include Indigenous people, must include free, prior, and informed consent, must include that recognition of Section 35, which brings the very essence of the Constitution of this country into question. That is the most uncomfortable space, and the space that we can also facilitate leadership from today in 2018 to make this country align the quality of the Indigenous relationship and what it needs to be, and what this energy discussion needs to be as well.
Just, it's okay for me to ask a question. Is there any, start taking off from that, is there anything in the experience of Indigenous people in reconciling their interests to each other that might be relevant to this reconciling the broader question? In Alberta here, for example, there's a thing called the Battle River, just north of Red Deer. It's the saw-off between the Northern Cree and the Blackfoot. There are graves on both sides. There used to be, that's why it's called the Battle River. In southern Alberta near Fort Whoop-Up, the last big battle between Aboriginal groups in Canada occurred there. 200 or 300 people were killed. A Cree hunting party got ambushed by Blackfoot people in their territory. In British Columbia, the relations between the Haida and the interior people, there was tension. Is there anything in the experience of Aboriginal folks in reconciling interests among themselves that might be relevant to this reconciliation in the broader picture?
I don't necessarily see that those historical ties amongst ourselves, but more the historical facilitation of the Indigenous relationship that allowed Canada to be what it is today. And I find it interesting that the focus of the discussion would come back to the formation of that. So the Indigenous allies, essentially, the invigorating of that is that possible to look at that from a policy perspective that is based on recognition, is based on operationalizing those core principles of which I spoke.
If I could just add something, I wouldn't speak on behalf of Aboriginal people, but I know that our foundation has worked with Aboriginal people since its inception, really. And one of the things and one of the reasons for that work is in looking precisely at reconciliation, of looking at different ways of knowing and how we see ourselves in the world. And one of the things that struck certainly David, our founder, and the rest of the organization was the idea of Aboriginal people living within and part of nature versus the way that we interpret nature in a Judeo-Christian way as man dominating nature and there simply to extract it. And that can sound a little bit idealistic, but with the idea then that Aboriginal people try to make decisions on how that will affect 7 generations down. So those might be little concepts, but those little concepts, if we start to try to think about what that would mean in our own ways of being and knowing, our own ways of acting, that might be a pretty interesting step towards reconciling different viewpoints and seeing how we can come together, how we can think a little bit differently together, and how we can approach this question of what is the national interest and how do we define it. And there are so many different pieces because everyone will define it differently. If I have 6 grandchildren and 21 great-grandchildren, I may be defining it on future generations far greater than if I'm 20 years old and just out of college. If I care about health and I've just seen someone in my family go through a health scare and I can see the relation of where that came from, the right to a healthy environment might be much higher. If I'm struggling to make ends meet and to pay my college debt, the highest thing might be economy. So we have to be able to bring all of these things together in defining what our national interest is. The second question from the floor, though, was on transformation, and it was interesting because it was a little bit about, well, if we make these policies and make some change, what about the unintended consequences and what's going to happen tomorrow? Can we really predict it? And the answer is, of course we can't. What science can do is can tell you about yesterday and about today. But it can't tell you exactly what you have to do for tomorrow. We can't predict the future. But transformation by its very nature is iterative, pivots, and responds to new technologies and to new things as they come. And that's how all of our tech industry is working and how all of Silicon Valley is working. And so if we're going to embark on a transformation, there's going to be some unknowns. There's going to be some difficulties. But in order to believe that we have to have it all planned out and everything in its box, that's simply not how transformation works.
You know, going back to this national interest question, I have some knowledge of large bipartisan initiatives and big leap forward programs that have been adopted nationally, and there is a constant each time, years and years of conversations taking place, invisible but absolutely essential, that have prepared those programs. And I think sometimes that we're hoping that there is a magic wand that will give us the possibility of avoiding those conversations, that work done by civil servants from provinces and the federal government sitting together, now with Indigenous nations represented at these tables, agreeing on evidence. You know, one of the problems we have at this moment is that we don't even agree on the evidence we should use for decisions. And when you look at our most important national programs, every time they have been preceded by years and 5-10 years of conversations that have prepared that the decision. So the national interest must be built. You know, it is not just something that you take out of an hat because you're a brilliant politician. It's something that needs a work of preparation. I hope this type of conference is part of that process of agreeing on evidence and preparing the future. I think I will take another question.
This panel's conversation is an excellent one, but if we start from Preston's point about moving things forward in non-coercive ways, what do we think Canada should do in a circumstance where consensus isn't available and some constituencies don't wish to compromise? And do we keep talking to try to achieve consensus, or do we accede to a veto by the minority and just not allow projects to proceed? Or do we side with the majority and in essence then use whatever measures, including security and suppressing protests and punishment for those that break the law? Do we side with the majority and say this is in the national interest? So where on that spectrum do we end up on these various issues?
And I will take a second question just beyond. Please. We don't see you a lot because of the lights, but okay. I see the at.
I think this lady was before me.
I will go to the other microphone after. Please ask your question.
Oh, yes, okay. Speaking about the national interest, I really wonder how we can possibly determine the national interest when we don't know what the effect of what we're doing now is on our environment. In Alberta, the water is not being assessed, the air is not being assessed. The effect of the oil and gas industry on our health, on our animals, on our human health, on our soils is not even being assessed. So how do we possibly regulate and how do we possibly determine the interest when we don't know what we're doing? If it takes 10 years of talking to determine what the national interest is, our environment doesn't have 10 years. I'm a rural Albertan. I see what is happening to our environment, particularly with the fracking that's going all across this province. And rural people know what's going on. But the regulator is captured, the assessment is not happening, much less proper regulation. how on earth do we keep up with what the effects are? And agriculture, I know, is a very big contributor. Our agricultural exports are a very big contributor to gross domestic product. How is that in the national interest to completely ignore what's happening to agriculture and to the agricultural producers when we have no measurement of that?
Yeah, please. I can't see you, so I have to guess. I see the polka dots. That's the only thing I can see.
There you go. So I think when we're talking about policies, and a lot of these are innovative policies, and Canada's becoming a leader, and one of the first in the world to implement these types of policies, no policy automatically is going to become perfect. It has to be tried, it has to be tested, mistakes are going to be made. But how do we create a policy environment where it's okay to take risks and it's okay to try innovative policies, and as soon as there's a few mistakes, there's not a huge pushback against the whole idea in general and a huge pushback against trying anything new to progress our policies?
Okay, Carissima, do you want to start? Yeah.
Sure, and just to go back to the question about national interest, I did want to say that being in the final stages of a monograph that actually looks at the references of Canadian courts. References have really been in the news, and they've been with us since 1875. I can confirm that it's always been difficult and highly contested and frankly vicious at times. The debates are over national interest, right back to Confederation. In terms of the first question about how do we decide when the interests are entrenched, I mean, if we look at the lessons from other areas of constitutional law, there are very few absolutes. So rights themselves do not exist in a hierarchy. There is an expectation of balancing and evidence before the government, let's say, takes a position that violates individual rights. There is a balancing required with respect to Section 35 and Indigenous peoples. And even in division of powers, there is a balance there between the federal and provincial governments. They are ultimately backstopped by some very powerful tools, that largely in favor of the federal government. But those tools, of course, come with costs, because you are, in effect, ending the conversation. So I think that the expectation is that you are able to put aside your immediate personal or institutional interests to take a broader sense of what is good policy, and to be able to justify that. And that's certainly what the courts demand when they are reviewing this kind of these kinds of decisions. Ultimately, there are some final points of decision, so the federal parliament can invoke the doctrine of paramountcy and actually supervene over provincial laws if they have their own valid legislation. And even with respect to Indigenous rights, the Supreme Court has held, and you can disagree with us if you like, that those themselves are not absolute. So there are mechanisms. They are used, I think, at the very, very end of the process. But I think as long as, again, I'm really emphasizing the process mechanisms. As long as you engage in that in a good faith way, you're not going to be able to satisfy all the interests to the extent that they want.
I can quickly go through we got about 3 questions on the table here. First one, that one about do we take into account second, third, and fourth order, and it gets into unintended consequences. I think that's very hard to, I would just start, let's get the first order effects right. The other thing, that we Canadians have a negative cast, like we assume that unintended consequences are all going to be negative. It's something in our psyche. Like if you ask Canadians, how are you today? The most frequent response is not too bad. Like that, we're trying to say something good with a double negative, and then we kind of modify it because we don't want to get too far out, not too bad. And I think this assuming that the unintended consequences are all going to be bad and all going to be wrong, that's wrong. Secondly, on this question of majority and minority rights, I think at the end of the day on these issues, and this ends up in the political arena, government tries to decide after taking into account all these rights, of having a fair process of the different interests. It decides on a course of action which it believes is in the public interest, and then it pushes it. And it pushes it hard, and it's going to offend certain people. And this pipeline thing, it's going to mean protesters chaining themselves to, and that's bad. But I think at the end of the day, we have to move forward. We're getting an international reputation that we can't do anything. Those Canadians can't make up their mind. Why did the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle? They want to always find the compromise, and in their search for the compromise, they don't get anywhere.
And we have heard that a lot this morning.
We did earlier. But the one caution, and I've talked to audiences about majority and minority rights. I say all of us that are in a majority on this better remember that we will be in a minority on that. So majorities have an interest in respecting minority rights because we're not always in the majority. And then the third thing we don't assess we're nowhere near assessing all the environmental impacts of economic activity. I think there's a need for doing more and more of that kind of assessment, and for doing environmental impact assessments on major economic activities and even minor ones. But the quid pro quo of that is we should do economic impact assessments on environmental proposals. That's the part that's missing. We've gone all the way to, we never did environmental, economic, or environmental impact assessments, and now where was the economic impact assessment of this carbon tax when the government first committed to it? And there's a host of those things. One last word on fracking, and this creates a challenge for environmental groups, and this may seem to be completely unrelated, but connects to foreign policy. There are two reasons why there might be war, and the United States involved in a war in the Middle East. One is relations with Israel and its neighbors. The other is over oil. The fact that the fracturing of tight oil and gas is going to make the United States self-sufficient in oil, which most of us would never have believed 10 years ago, is going to reduce one of the major causes of tension in the Middle East. The United States will not have the same vested interest in Middle East oil supplies as it has in the past. Now, what does one do if one's an environmentalist? If the cost of some peace in the Middle East is the fracturing of tight oil and gas, recognizing it can be done, it should be done, it could be done more environmentally responsible. Where's your trade-off? Would you ban fracking if you increase the probability of war in the Middle East? These are the hard choices for government. It's not between what's totally good and totally evil. It's between two objectives, both of which are good, but how do you trade them off?
Can I have a hot pursuit on something you said, and it's not what you think. It's actually about this idea of unintended consequences all being negative, and really feeds into this conversation. I had the great privilege to go down in the mines in Sudbury about 2 years ago. And Paul mentioned it this morning on the sulfur regulations and the big problem that we had with acid rain. And when that was being discussed, we didn't have all the time in the world to have a discussion for 20 years. We had to do something about it. And so it came down to regulation. But at the time, the nickel mine said there is no way we can put cleaner stacks on our stacks. If we do, we will be out of business and we will be gone. But the regulations came down, and there was not ifs and buts. There was a mechanism to ensure that the transition would be just. There were funds to help. The costs were judged to be astronomical. The time it would take would be forever. Remember, at the time, Sudbury was the most polluted place on Earth. Everywhere else that had environmental problems used to measure the environmental problems in Sudbury units. You were 1/2 of a Sudbury unit, or 1/4 of a Sudbury unit. No one had ever been to a Sudbury unit before Sudbury. All of the lakes in the whole region were completely poisoned. All the fish was dead. Many of you have probably visited. I went there as a kid. You could chop little pieces off the rock. It looked like Mars. That's why they did the stuff there. But the long story short, though, is that Sudbury is now the world leader in environmental mining, in mechanized mining. They have a mining school. They have an architect school. You buy a cottage on the lake in Sudbury, $1 million. And the business is going better than ever. They have the smallest footprint of nickel mines anywhere in the world. And this is something that was done in 30 years. We have 30 years to take some action and to do something. 30 to 50 years. We could put it all off, and our kids can deal with it. We won't be here, so we can actually just hang up our shingles. But they did it in 30 years, and the magic thing was they did it for a third the cost and in half the time. And it was mentioned this morning why it's not only the new innovation that comes along, it's when you start treating energy, the energy inputs go down, so you save money, and when you start treating what we would have called waste, sulfur at the time, you dropped a match on the ground in Sudbury, it would burn. Sudbury now takes their sulfur and sells their sulfur as product. So when we change from the way that we look at what our waste is and turn it into product, and when we become more efficient and look at efficiencies as a reduction of wasted energy, we can do amazing things. But we need the right pulls and pushes, both of federal legislation, but also then of industry and technology taking over to be able to take us across the line.
So I like the fact that we're moving from process to the answer to the panel's question, which was about good policy. But
yes, I feel like I'm listening to three blind men describing the elephant they found. You know, is it a snake or is it a big board or something? To start with this whole process, I would have listed some principles of what public policy should be. And if I could throw some suggestions, it should be available. And that sounds like a ridiculous sort of thing, but if it's not available, we live in a very tough climate. Could be killing you if whatever the form of that energy is not available. And it has to be affordable. And we've seen German who've had to make the decision between energy and heat and food. Equality. Should we have different standards for different kinds of energy? Safety, and I think this speaks to itself. Anything that is against humans, whether it be SOx, NOx, particulates. And it wasn't very long ago, 5 years ago to be exact, that we lost 47 people, you know, like McGinty. Regulated, and regulated is a very complex sort of thing. When you want to set a rate base, you have to, you know, study it and do that. And we have already set up organizations to do that. We shouldn't just throw them in the garbage heap. And secondly, very rarely after we've set up the experts to do that, should we intervene. And of course, the last one is Canadian. And if we can supply energy to Canada, not only do we have security of supply, but we're creating wealth. And to import oil for the East Coast, but not Canadian, as an oil producer, it doesn't make any sense. To get one last item, Steve Williams talked about science. And all of the whole morning has been talked about greenhouse gases as a given. And this tsunami of believing in this theory may well be receding, and we see the Americans backing off Paris Accord. They've got Pruitt running the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And the bottom line is the science is out there. I'm an earth scientist, and I can tell you that 1,000 years ago, we were much warmer. History tells us that when Greenland was settled. The ice cores tell us in science. And the science also tells us that the sun varies its heat. And in my household, if you turn the furnace down, it gets colder. Thank you.
thank you. So for me, there's two questions embedded in this intervention. One is about, is there a set of principles on which or around which we could build a national consensus on what to do next? And of course, the second one is about the evidence on the table and what is the evidence base? You know, again, the blurb for the conference, I noticed that when I looked at it yesterday, talk about concrete evidence. I'm always interested to know what people, it's one thing to say concrete evidence, it's another thing to define what will be accepted as receivable and concrete evidence. So I think there's two interesting questions. Caroline, you want to start?
Sure. I like where you are going with those principles, and definitely I see the leadership lacking largely from that absence of principled design in this overall energy discussion. I would also include Indigenous requirements within that. That is the modern reality of Canada, and the Indigenous requirements to be included that within a principle of design. The requirements of the country today is free, prior, and informed consent, and the ability to see that the reference as Indigenous peoples as stakeholders or special interest groups is actually very distinct of how it's defined within the constitution of the country. So the inclusion of that and the representation of that in this discussion will be essential.
Yeah, I take that list. I think that's a good list of criteria for evaluating both your economic position and your environmental position. So I put that list. Is it affordable? Is it equitable? Is it inclusive? Is it Canadian? Is it properly regulated? And I would ask that in relation to your energy development policy, in relation to your environmental policy. I just make a matrix out of that. With respect to the skepticism about global warming and the science, the way when I encounter someone that's skeptical about that, I say, okay, let's go somewhere else. Like, is there any kind of pollution that you do recognize? And usually people will say, yes, there is. Okay, so you're skeptical about that. But you're worried about industrial garbage. You're worried about what's happening to the water, whatever. Then let's have a discussion. What's the best mechanism for dealing with that? Do we try to figure out the avoidance and mitigative measures and incorporate the cost of those measures in the price of the product or the service? Or do we try to fix it by macro and micro regulation? You don't have to abandon the discussion of pollution pricing because someone's skeptical about one particular area. And I actually think it's unfortunate that this concept of pollution pricing got so far ahead on the climate change thing, because it introduces a whole other area that people won't consider doing something else about the environment because they're hung up on the reality or the unreality of that.
And I would also say that as important as evidence is in this discussion, there is also a really fundamental role for public messaging and just communicating norms, right? So we know, for example, that criminal law does a pretty bad job of deterring the people it should most deter. But that's not the only reason that we actually enact criminal offenses. It's to send messages about behavior that we think is wrong or that we wish to discourage. In this case, we might see it as what is the behavior that we might wish to incent. And that's a decision that public policymakers are entitled to take within a larger political framework. So evidence, of course, is important, but there is also a larger role for our conversations about the environment.
There's two things here that I think are important. One is the complexity factor makes it very hard to explain and to engage and to do the communications, which are fundamental, because otherwise we will roll back and it will be used in wedge fashion and political fashion, all kinds of ways. But Preston, you opened up some of the international perspectives on this because we're kind of doing this little binomial between our environment and our energy, and that's all that's linked together. And we've just flowered a little bit on health concerns. We saw how with health, when you stop coal fires, you have, instead of 7.2 preemies per 100,000, you have 5 preemies per 100,000. It's pretty clear. The science has also done the math on the health costs that we're currently paying for asthma, for heart conditions, for all kinds of things due to particulate matter in our own atmosphere. When we stopped the coal fire plants in Toronto, we went down from 50 smog days a year to 0 within 3 years. So health is one factor. I've come from a different place. I came from Doctors Without Borders, as was mentioned this morning. So I've seen what's going on around the world where the climate consequences are very real and right now. You have multi-year droughts that are forcing people to flee because they can't rely on agriculture anymore. So they're starving to death. We have migration going on all across the world that also has impacts on geopolitics and that become a drain. In our own societies, you never put one storm as, one storm is weather. But when you look at the overall rise in natural disasters over the last 25 years, over 30% and you have 70 to 80% of the population now living in cities that are extremely vulnerable to rise in tornadoes, rise in floods. You just watch the news. We are all watching the news, and every year we have a 100-year storm, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So the cost to insurers and to the economy in Canada alone is in the billions recovering from our yearly flooding. So you've seen just the other day in New Brunswick, for the first time, instead of just rebuilding and rebuilding on the national purse, they're starting to think about, do we actually have to start mitigating and start ensuring that if you're going to rebuild your house, it's either going to be in a different place, or if it's in the same place, it's going to be built higher, so it's going to be above the floodplains. So we have to get beyond, and this is a discussion that's going to include many different areas. It's going to include food production here, because when you change the climate, what you're really doing is you're changing when the rain falls and when the rain doesn't fall. That's more important than the idea that warming is going to make it all too hot in the short term. And if the rain's not falling, then you're going to have agricultural production problems that are going to be all over and around the globe. And the last thing on that is the disease patterns. And this I can speak to, having seen it firsthand. Disease patterns and species are changing their places because the climate is warming, regardless of why. Regardless of why, we have places now dealing with new diseases and vectors, and we're in the same boat. We've got small things happening. We have Lyme disease in Ontario that's spreading across all of the Maritimes and the central regions. And out here, we've got pine beetle and other types of things that the winter's not killing anymore, so they're destroying our forests. So we do have to have a bigger conversation, but not just back and forth between the price of oil and I drive my car, because that's too reductionist.
Okay, I would like to talk two last questions before we...
There for Preston, when you talk about a pollutant, when you breathe in, you have 400 part per million carbon. That's 1 out of 2,500 molecules. You exhale it, at 40,000. It's 100 times as much. So if you call carbon dioxide a pollutant, we're all guilty. And secondly, you forget the other part of the unanticipated consequences is this is a great help for growing plants. And we've had record grain crops. And some of it's by fertilizer, some of it's GM, but I wish the economists could sit down and say how much of the record grain crops is associated with a higher carbon dioxide in the air.
Your question, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe bring us back up to a bigger idea and perhaps even challenge one of the operating assumptions that I think that we've heard today, which is if only we can do a better job of getting to consensus. We've heard a lot about the national interest, the public interest, the greater good. But Canadians are not alone. There's a global movement away from consensus in industrialized worlds. We're far less concerned as individuals about the greater good as opposed to what's in it for me. So I would like to challenge in terms of how we propose for those who are in political leadership roles to actually have to navigate, have to reconcile what seems to be irreconcilable differences. How are you going to do that if consensus is not possible? We've operated on the assumption of just getting better to consensus. What if it's not? What if we still have to find a way to get sufficient interests aligned and move forward? Are we going to live in a world where we have policy paralysis? Or are we going to have to move towards more and more aggressive policy development? Polarization is not new in Canada, and it's not new around the world, and it's not likely going away. So if we have to live in that type of world, how do we make policy choices to move forward?
This is not a complete answer to your question, but it's maybe part of it. And I know we're running out of time, so I did want to get onto this. And people have referred to, there's a communications problem here that was talked about in the earlier session. And I've had a little bit of experience of trying to convince ordinary people to do something that they didn't want to do. And if on that discussion this morning, but if you're in the elevator with somebody that's not even sure this is a problem or whatever, my rule is ask first and tell second. and particularly if you're the head of an interest group, if you're a high-ranking politician who thinks he's got it all figured out, if you're a civil servant, and if you're an academic. The higher you up in that hierarchy, the more you're inclined to tell the guy because he doesn't understand what you're talking about. My rule is ask first. Ask the guy in the elevator, like, do you ever worry about pollution of any kind, you know? And then sometimes something will come out of it. If it doesn't come out of that, well, what about, this is a question, what about garbage? What about the water? What about that CO2 stuff? And then when you're getting around to your solution, you put it in the form of a question. What would you think about, suppose we figured out what the impact was and we figured out how to solve it and we put the cost of it into the product. Like, but you're asking, not telling. And I think one of the weaknesses in a lot of this debate on these issues is particularly the more passionate we are about it and the more we think we've known about it and we've studied it for 30 years, so listen to me, the more we back off of that and ask. And then we once, well, it was actually the election campaign that got us to be the official opposition. The first 2 weeks of the thing, we had a session called Let the People Speak. You know, in the first weeks of an election campaign, the politician's supposed to go out and say, this election is about, which is telling. And so we had these meetings. Our strategists thought we were crazy. So who knows what's going to come out when you ask those people what they, but you know, we passed the mic around. So what do you think it's about? And then I'll respond to it. And I think if there's one lesson we learn on this communication of these ideas is to ask first and tell second. And in listening to the answers to the ask, we may find the hooks in people's heads to say what we want to say. You know.
Carissima? So maybe my last question for the group.
They're afraid to tell now. You see, we've frozen up.
No.
Yeah. God forbid we should tell anybody anything.
My last question is, basically as a way to wrap up is last week or the week before I was giving a talk and I was asked at the end, if you were Minister of Health, you're so clever. If you were Minister of Health, what you will be doing? And so this is a question I will ask you. If you are the Prime Minister, what you will be doing at this stage? What is the good policy, if you were given the choice, that you will push forward at this moment? So I was exactly in that stage when asking that question.
Well, I'm going to answer with my sense is the Prime Minister is not in the space that he hoped he would be in, nor his cabinet. So I don't think that they are setting the agenda anymore. I think they are running behind it, trying to piece it back together. And that's not an enviable position to be in.
I'm going to come back to the concept of effect. And was the intended effect to be investable? I believe that is the potential to have missed the mark from a global perspective. And in being the Prime Minister, a return to what is an investable environment requires a reset that would come back to Preston's point in regards to asking first and telling later.
Well, I would quote George Santayana when he supposedly said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I would sit down with Jason and said, look at your dad's experience. He was elected in 1968 and there was a crisis that had to be dealt with, the OPEC oil crisis, a quadrupling of oil prices. You got elected in 2015 and you've got a crisis you're dealing with, the global warming crisis. One of the things your dad immediately did was institute a tax, the petroleum gas revenue tax, which moved $100 billion worth of wealth out of the oil-producing provinces to the federal treasury and the consuming provinces. What's one of the first things you've done? You've instituted a tax, the carbon tax. What was the third thing your dad did? He created an instrument so that the federal government could get more involved in the energy sector. He acquired private sector oil assets and put them into a crown corporation, Petrocan. What have you just done? You've just acquired a company in the oil patch and you're turning it into a crown corporation. And fourthly, he promised that when that corporation, after it had done its duty, it would be returned to the private sector and the taxpayer would be refunded and all would be well. There's people in this room that know that when Petro-Canada was privatized, its shares went from $13 to $8. Its loss in the first year was $603 million. And 6,000 people, many of them in this town, lost their jobs because it went from 11,000 employees to 5,000. I'd say, are there not lessons from, we have been to this rodeo before, some of us here, the older people. And then maybe if I was really impolite, I would get to the last part. In 1968, when your dad was elected with a majority government, he had 154 seats. After that was over in the 32nd Parliament, he had 40 seats. Like, why can we not learn from what we did before, not just on the policy side, but on the political side as well? The course of action, in my judgment, that the federal government is on is not one that is good for it politically, let alone solving the problems that we're dealing with.
Just very quickly, and I think most prime ministers and most federal governments learn this, you're just not as in control, as powerful as the federal government is. You're just not as in control as you might like. And you can't stop a premier from shooting off their mouth and making investors skittish, and you can't stop people from going to court. You can't stop other orders of government from going to court, and you need to accept that. You probably need to bake that into whatever decisions you're making. You probably need to make decisions a bit quicker, and deal with that, and accept that reality that we are in a messy political environment, but we have a federation that has endured. You know, one of the things that I've learned in my work is just the improbability of Canada surviving as a federation in the way that it has. I mean, that is a huge success story, but it has these messy components, and the federal government needs to exist within that reality.
Well, first of all, so thank you to all of you for your comments and participation in this panel. Thank you so very much. So, in a way, it's the end, because it's the end of the morning and of this conference. The first thing I want to do on behalf of the school, but also on behalf of the organizers, like Chris did this morning, thank my partners in this endeavor, the McGill School of Public Policy. I get used to it slowly, McGill School of Public Policy at McGill. And the Ecofiscal Commission. Remarkable, very pleasant to work with partners, and I hope you have enjoyed the organization. Thank you for the participants, to our speakers and panelists this morning. Thank you for the organizers from the three organizations, the three institutions, and of course, thank you to the audience, particularly on my behalf, because you asked much better questions than I can ask. So, and this was broadcast on the web, so you were featured this morning to a much broader audience. In 2007, I organized here in Calgary a large conference on, the theme was, guess what, the conciliation between economic growth, economic development, and the environment. I was at the Trudeau Foundation at the time. The current Prime Minister was in attendance with some members of an inner circle. I don't know if I had any influence of his thinking, but it's very clear that when Justin Trudeau was elected last year, he has decided that he will ride two horses at the same time. You know, those two horses of economic growth and protection of the environment. And I don't know if you have ever seen someone riding two horses in a circus or in a rodeo, but you know, the James Maxton, he was a Scottish politician in the 1920s in Britain. He said, talking about politics, that if you couldn't ride two horses at the same time, you have no place in the circus. And so it's important for politicians to know how to do that. But the conditions of success, as you could imagine, if you have ever seen that, you know that, is that you have to have the horses progressing at the same pace, first of all, and secondly, progressing in the same direction. And you know, when again, my own opinion, and of course not the opinion of my partners or my colleagues at the school, but it's clear when I look at the performance of the government in the last 2 years, my impression is that they had a lot of trouble about the pace. And the impression was that the two horses were not progressing at the same pace. And I think this is part of the conversation or the debate we have about the performance of the government on those issues. On the other end, they were served by a general consensus on the direction, and that helped them a lot. But what happened if you don't have the same pace, the same direction? You know, you have two choices. You fall, or you pick one horse against the other. And this is probably where we are at this moment. unless more conversations of this sort, more integration of thinking about those issues take place, and that we could help them find a way to make the horse again, ride at the same pace, and of course having the same direction in the national interest. Safe travel for those of you who are going back home. Thank you for your participation again, and enjoy the rest of your day in this beautiful city. Thank you.